The sun was rising over the Atlanta skyline as Anthony Wilson looked out from his office window. 30 years ago, he'd been hauling luggage across this very airport, his back aching, hands calloused, but his mind always dreaming bigger. Now, at 58, he owned the entire airline. Anthony smiled as he adjusted the family photo on his desk. His journey hadn't been easy. Born to a bus driver and a schoolteacher, he'd worked after-school jobs since he was 14. College had been a patchwork of scholarships, loans, and night shifts. But Anthony had something special, a vision for how air travel could be different, more inclusive, more humane. "Mr. Wilson, your wife is online too," his assistant called through the intercom. He picked up the phone, his face softening at the sound of Denise's voice. They'd met in business school, 2 of only 7 black students in their class. While others underestimated them, they'd recognized something in each other: determination, intelligence, and a refusal to be defined by other people's expectations. "Don't forget we're picking up the kids at 11, Denise reminded him. Their son Christopher was graduating from business school tomorrow in Los Angeles. Their daughter Tanya was flying in from New York, where she managed the airline's East Coast operations. After hanging up, Anthony flipped through the latest passenger satisfaction reports. Jackson Airways had started with just 2 planes and 4 destinations. He'd named it after his grandmother, the woman who'd raised him after his parents died, who'd taught him that dignity wasn't something others gave you, it was something you carried inside. The airline now boasted a fleet of 67 aircraft serving domestic and international routes. What made Anthony most proud wasn't the profits but the principles. Jackson Airways had the most diverse workforce in the industry. They hired veterans, single parents, people with disabilities, folks other companies overlooked. Their training emphasized respect for every passenger regardless of appearance or background. Anthony closed the folder and checked his watch. Most CEOs of major airlines traveled with entourages in private jets. Not him. Anthony preferred flying commercial, his own airline, sitting among regular passengers. It kept him honest, grounded, aware of what the actual customer experience was like. Few passengers ever recognized him. Anthony liked it that way. His security team hated it, but he insisted on this small piece of normalcy. He'd never been someone who flashed his success around. The lesson his grandmother taught him still guided everything. True character shows in how you treat people when you think nobody important is watching. In the hallway outside his office hung portraits of every employee who'd been with the company for over 20 years. Anthony knew most of them by name. He'd started this tradition because he remembered how invisible he felt as a baggage handler, how managers would walk past without a glance, as if he were just another piece of equipment. His phone buzzed with a text from Denise. "Packed your suit for the ceremony. Don't forget Christopher's gift." Anthony smiled. Their son had followed in their footsteps, but insisted on making his own way. He turned down an executive position at Jackson Airways to work at a startup focused on sustainable aviation fuel. Anthony couldn't have been prouder. The family rarely used their connection to the airline for special treatment. They checked in like everyone else, stood in the same lines, dealt with the same hassles. Anthony believed privileges should be earned, not expected. As he gathered his things to leave, Anthony's assistant handed him the family's boarding passes. First-class tickets to Los Angeles, a small splurge for Christopher's big day. "Your car is waiting downstairs, sir," she said. Anthony nodded, buttoning his jacket. Tomorrow would be a family celebration. Little did he know it would also become a powerful test of everything he believed in. A moment that would challenge not just his patience, but the very culture he'd spent decades building. The morning of the flight was unusually hectic. Anthony and Denise rushed around their bedroom, tossing last-minute items into suitcases while their daughter Tanya sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone. "Dad, have you seen the latest passenger numbers?" Tanya asked, her business mind never fully switching off. "We're up 12% this quarter." Anthony smiled, zipping his garment bag. "Today, no shop talk. Today we're just family." Denise emerged from the bathroom, her natural hair wrapped in a colorful silk scarf. "You too and your numbers. Can we just enjoy Christopher's big day without turning it into a board meeting?" They all laughed. For the Wilsons, the line between family and business had always been blurry. The airline wasn't just Anthony's career, It was their shared legacy, built on countless dinner table conversations and weekend sacrifices. Anthony checked his watch. The car will be here in 15 minutes. Their driver, Lewis, had worked for the family for nearly a decade. As they loaded the luggage into the SUV, he shared stories about his daughter's college applications. The Wilsons listened intently. They'd helped put Lewis's older son through community college with their employee education fund. "How's Jeffrey doing at the Aviation Academy?" Anthony asked. Lewis beamed with pride. "Top of his class, Mr. Wilson. Says he wants to be a pilot for Jackson Airways someday." "Tell him to come see me when he graduates," Anthony said, meaning every word. He built his company on this principle, giving opportunities to hard-working people regardless of their background. Atlanta traffic was mercifully light as they headed to the airport. Tanya pointed out the massive Jackson Airways billboard along the highway, their newest ad campaign featuring diverse families boarding a plane with the slogan "Everyone belongs in the sky." At the terminal, Anthony insisted they use the regular check-in line rather than the VIP entrance. "Dad, we're going to be late," Tanya protested. "People are watching," Denise whispered, nodding toward a group of employees who had noticed them. Anthony shook his head. "We wait like everyone else." When they finally reached the counter, the ticket agent did a double take. "Mr. Wilson, I didn't expect we could have arranged." "Just checking in for our flight," Anthony said with a warm smile. "How's your day going, Thomas?" He read the name tag, making the young man stand a little straighter. "Very well, sir. It's an honor to have you flying with us today." Thomas processed their boarding passes with extra care, his hands slightly shaking. Few employees ever met the owner face to face. "You're doing a great job," Anthony said quietly. "Been with us long?" 6 months, sir. Just finished training." "Keep it up. We notice good work." In the security line, Denise linked her arm through Anthony's. "Always recruiting, aren't you?" "Just being friendly," he protested, though they both knew better. Anthony had built Jackson Airways by seeing potential in people that other companies overlooked. They made their way through the terminal, stopping occasionally when employees recognized them. Anthony knew many by name: the wheelchair attendant whose medical bills the company had helped with, the gate agent who'd suggested their popular pre-boarding for families with young children. At the gate, they found a quiet corner to wait. Denise pulled out Christopher's graduation gift, a vintage compass that had belonged to Anthony's grandfather. "Do you think he'll like it?" she asked, polishing the brass with her sleeve. "It's perfect," Anthony said, his voice thick with emotion. "A reminder that no matter how far he flies, he'll always find his way home." The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers. The Wilsons gathered their carry-ons, unaware that their family celebration was about to become something entirely different. As they approached the gate, Anthony noticed a flight attendant watching them with an expression he knew all too well: the slight narrowing of eyes, the quick assessment that saw their skin color before seeing their boarding passes. Anthony took a deep breath. After 30 years in the airline industry, he thought he'd be used to it by now. But some things you never got used to. "First-class passengers may now board," the gate agent announced, her voice warm and professional. Anthony nodded to his family, and they stepped forward with their boarding passes. Other first-class passengers, mostly men in business suits, moved toward the gate at the same time. The agent smiled as she scanned the Wilsons' tickets, wishing them a pleasant flight. Just as they stepped onto the jet bridge, a flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a tight smile positioned herself at the entrance to the aircraft. Her name tag read Patricia. She greeted the businessmen ahead of them with practiced charm, directing them to their seats with a flourish. When the Wilsons approached, Patricia's smile stiffened. "Boarding passes, please," she said, her tone notably cooler. Anthony handed them over. Patricia studied the passes with unusual scrutiny, looking from the papers to their faces and back again. "There seems to be some confusion," she said loudly. "These are first-class seats." Several passengers behind them stopped talking, suddenly paying attention. "Yes, they are," Anthony replied calmly. "Is there a problem?" Patricia's eyebrows arched. "Well, you're in boarding group 1, which is for our first-class cabin." She emphasized the words as if explaining something complicated to a child. Denise stepped closer. "We're aware of that. We have first-class tickets." Patricia glanced at the growing line behind them. Perhaps you misunderstood the announcement. Economy boarding hasn't started yet. Tanya, who had inherited her father's business sense but her mother's directness, spoke up. We didn't misunderstand anything. Our boarding passes clearly show seats 2A through 2D in first class. Patricia reluctantly looked down at the boarding passes again. By now, several passengers were watching the exchange with uncomfortable expressions. These must have been upgraded, Patricia muttered, though the passes showed they were regular first-class tickets, not upgrades. I'll need to verify this with the gate agent. Is there a reason you need to verify our tickets when you didn't verify anyone else's? Anthony asked, his voice quiet but firm. A businessman behind them cleared his throat awkwardly. I didn't have to show my boarding pass twice, he admitted. Patricia flushed. I'm just following procedure. Which procedure is that exactly? Tanya asked. Her hand had slipped into her pocket, where Anthony knew she was recording the interaction on her phone, a habit she'd developed after too many similar experiences. The gate agent, overhearing the commotion, hurried down the jet bridge. Is everything all right? This flight attendant seems to think there's something wrong with our first-class tickets, Denise explained. The gate agent glanced at Patricia, then at the Wilsons, recognition dawning in her eyes. There's absolutely no issue with their tickets, she said firmly. Mr. Wilson and his family are cleared for first class. Patricia's face showed confusion, then shock as she processed the name. Wilson. As in? Please, let's not make a scene, Anthony said quietly. We just like to board and get settled like everyone else. Patricia stepped aside, her face now a mask of professional courtesy. Of course, my apologies for the confusion. Right this way. As they moved past her, Anthony felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, that mixture of anger, exhaustion, and resignation that came with these moments. He'd faced this same skepticism countless times over his career, from his days as a baggage handler to now as the owner of the entire airline. Inside the aircraft, another flight attendant directed them to their seats with genuine warmth. Anthony helped Denise store her bag in the overhead compartment, then settled into his seat by the window. He watched the Atlanta tarmac, workers scurrying around with luggage carts and fuel hoses, all wearing the Jackson Airways uniform he personally helped design. You okay? Denise whispered, placing her hand over his. I'm fine, he said, though they both knew he wasn't. Even after all these years, even after all his success, moments like these still had the power to wound. Dad, Tanya leaned across the aisle. Patricia just realized who you are. You should see her face. She almost looked amused. Anthony shook his head. Let's just enjoy our flight to Christopher's graduation. That's all that matters today. But as Patricia entered the cabin, avoiding eye contact with the Wilson family, Anthony knew this incident wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The first-class cabin buzzed with the usual pre-takeoff activity. Flight attendants offered champagne and orange juice while passengers settled into their seats. Everyone except the Wilson family, that is. Patricia moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, smiling warmly at each passenger until she reached row 2. There, she seemed to develop sudden blindness, repeatedly skipping over the Wilsons as she offered drinks and hanging jackets. Excuse me, Tanya said as Patricia breezed past for the third time. Could I get some water, please? Patricia's smile tightened. First-class passengers get priority service. I'll get to you when I can. The businessman across the aisle looked up in confusion. But they are in first class, he said, gesturing to their seats. Patricia's cheeks flushed. Of course. I'll be right back. Unbelievable, Tanya muttered, pulling out her phone again. Anthony placed a gentle hand on her arm. Let it go, sweetheart. Dad, you've spent your whole life letting things go. Look where that got you. You literally own this airline, and they're still treating us like we don't belong. Denise sighed. Your father doesn't let things go. He just handles them differently. Anthony gazed out the window. Tanya wasn't entirely wrong. He'd built his career on turning the other cheek, on proving himself through excellence rather than confrontation. But at what cost? Should his children still have to face the same battles he had? Patricia returned with a single glass of water, practically dropping it on Tanya's tray before hurrying away. A different flight attendant, an older man with kind eyes, appeared with warm towels for everyone in the row, giving the Wilsons an apologetic smile. "First time flying with us?" he asked, his name tag reading Robert. "You could say that," Anthony replied with a small smile. The plane pushed back from the gate. During the safety demonstration, Patricia's gaze skipped over their row entirely, as if the 4 seats were empty. When she collected trash after the beverage service, she held the bag at arm's length when she reached Anthony, barely glancing his way. "Does she know who you are?" The businessman across the aisle whispered, leaning toward Anthony. "I recognized you right away. Anthony Wilson, right? My company just signed that cargo contract with your airline last month. I'm Thomas Reed, by the way." They shook hands as Patricia watched from the galley, her eyes widening slightly. "Nice to meet you, Thomas. That's a good contract for both of us." "I've followed your career for years," Thomas continued, oblivious to Patricia's growing discomfort. "From baggage handler to CEO, it's the American dream, isn't it?" Patricia dropped the trash bag she was holding. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the tension in first class became almost palpable. Patricia made a visible effort to avoid their section, asking other flight attendants to serve their row instead. When Denise pressed the call button to request a blanket, Patricia pretended not to notice until Robert stepped in. "I've got it," he told her, grabbing a blanket from the overhead bin. In the galley, passengers could overhear Patricia whispering to another flight attendant. "They just don't understand how things work up here. It's not like coach where everyone just—" "They're not from coach," Robert interrupted loudly enough for several passengers to hear. "That man has probably flown more miles than everyone on this plane combined." Tanya leaned across to her father. "This is exactly why your Respect All Passengers training program exists, Dad. Maybe you should remind her who wrote it." Anthony shook his head. "This isn't about me or who I am. It's about basic human dignity. Everyone deserves the same respect, whether they own the airline or not." Denise squeezed his hand. "I know that look. What are you planning?" Before Anthony could answer, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. Weather in Los Angeles looks clear, and we should be arriving on schedule. I'd like to take a moment to mention that we have some special passengers with us today." Anthony tensed. He hadn't asked for any announcement. He never did. The founder and CEO of Jackson Airways, Mr. Anthony Wilson, and his family are traveling with us in first class today. Every head in the cabin turned toward them. And Patricia, who was in the middle of pouring coffee for a passenger, froze completely, the cup overflowing as the color drained from her face. The coffee continued to spill onto the passenger's tray table as Patricia stood frozen, the pot tilted at an angle. The businessman jumped up, napkins in hand. "Hey, watch it," he said, breaking her trance. Patricia snapped back to reality, frantically mopping up the spill while stealing glances at Anthony. The first-class cabin had fallen silent. Every passenger was now looking between the Wilson family and the flight attendant who had been treating them poorly for the past hour. I'm so sorry about that, sir," Patricia stammered to the coffee-splashed passenger. Her hands trembled as she collected the soaked napkins. Anthony unbuckled his seatbelt. "Denise, I'll be right back." "Go easy on her," Denise whispered, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to Patricia getting what was coming to her. Anthony made his way to the galley where Patricia was hiding, pretending to restock the drink cart. Robert, the kind flight attendant, gave Anthony a respectful nod. "Mr. Wilson, I'm so sorry about—" "No need, Robert. You've been professional throughout." Anthony turned to Patricia, whose face had gone from pale to bright red. "Could I have a word with you and the lead flight attendant, please?" Patricia looked like she might faint. "Mr. Wilson, I had no idea who you were. I would never have." "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Anthony said quietly. "The way you treat people shouldn't depend on who they are or what they can do for you." The lead flight attendant, a woman with gray streaked hair named Beverly, appeared from behind the curtain. "Mr. Wilson, this is an honor. What can I do for you? Could we speak privately, please?" Anthony gestured toward the rear galley. As they walked through the plane, Anthony noticed how passengers in economy stared at him with curiosity. A young flight attendant whispered to her colleague, "That's him, that's the owner." In the rear galley, Beverly closed the curtain to give them privacy. Patricia stood with her head bowed, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "First, I want to thank you both for your service to this airline," Anthony began, catching them off guard. "Beverly, how long have you been with us?" 23 years, sir." "And Patricia?" 7 years, she whispered, barely audible. Anthony nodded. 7 years. That's a long time to work somewhere and not understand its core values. Patricia's lower lip trembled. "Mr. Wilson, please. I have kids. I need this job." "I'm not here to fire you," Anthony said. "That would be too easy, and it wouldn't solve anything." Beverly and Patricia exchanged confused glances. "The issue isn't just how you treated me or my family," Anthony continued. "It's about how you might treat any passenger who doesn't fit your image of what a first-class traveler should look like." Patricia stared at the floor. "I'm not. I don't think I'm racist." Anthony finished for her. "Maybe not intentionally. But our biases show in our actions, not our intentions." Beverly shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Wilson, I assure you this isn't how we train our staff." "I know. I wrote the training manual." Anthony's voice remained calm, but firm. "Here's what's going to happen. Patricia, when we land, you'll be temporarily reassigned." Patricia's head snapped up, tears forming. "Sir, please." "To our training department," Anthony continued. "For the next month, you'll help teach our new flight attendants about customer service and dignity. You'll share what you learned today as a case study." Confusion replaced fear on Patricia's face. "You want me to teach?" "The best lessons come from our mistakes," Anthony said. "And I believe people deserve second chances. I got plenty of them on my way up." A tear slid down Patricia's cheek. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just do better." Anthony checked his watch. "Now I'd like to get back to my family. We're celebrating my son's graduation, and I don't want this incident to overshadow his achievement." As Anthony turned to leave, Beverly touched his arm. "Sir, not many CEOs would handle this the way you have." Anthony smiled slightly. "Maybe that's why not many companies have the culture we're trying to build." He paused, then added, "And Beverly? Please tell the captain I appreciate his announcement, but I prefer to fly without fanfare in the future." When Anthony returned to his seat, the entire first-class cabin watched him. Tanya raised an eyebrow. "Well, is she fired?" "No," Anthony said simply, buckling his seatbelt. "Dad," Tanya protested. "After how she treated us?" Denise studied her husband's face. "He has something better in mind, don't you?" Anthony nodded, gazing out at the clouds below. "Sometimes the hardest lesson to learn is having to teach others what you wish you'd known yourself." The remainder of the flight passed in awkward tension. Patricia avoided the Wilson family entirely, with Robert taking over their service. Passengers kept stealing glances at Anthony, some even working up the courage to shake his hand as they walked to the restroom. "Mr. Wilson, my daughter works in your Dallas office," one woman said. "She always talks about how much she loves the company culture." Anthony smiled genuinely. "What's her name? I'll look out for her next time I'm there." When the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Tanya was still fuming. "I can't believe you're letting her off so easily," she whispered to her father. "Who says it's easy?" Anthony replied. "Facing your mistakes is harder than losing your job. Trust me on this." As they deplanned, Patricia stood at the exit, thanking passengers with a stiff smile. When the Wilsons approached, she looked directly at Anthony. "Thank you for flying with Jackson Airways today, Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice steadier than before. "And I'm truly sorry." Anthony nodded. "I'll see you in the training department next week." The Los Angeles terminal buzzed with activity as they made their way to baggage claim. Christopher was waiting for them, tall and handsome in a crisp button-down shirt. He embraced his parents and sister with warm hugs. "How was the flight?" he asked innocently. The three Wilsons exchanged glances before Denise laughed. "Your father had another teaching moment." Christopher groaned. "Dad, you promised no business on this trip." "It found me this time," Anthony said with a shrug. That evening in their hotel suite, as they prepared for dinner, Anthony's phone rang. It was Beverly, the lead flight attendant. "Mr. Wilson, I wanted to let you know that Patricia asked to speak with you tomorrow before you leave Los Angeles. Would that be possible?" Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Did she say what about?" "No, sir, but she seemed different. Thoughtful, maybe." After hanging up, Anthony told Denise about the call. "You think she's worried about her job?" Denise asked, fastening her earrings. "Maybe. Or maybe something else is happening." Anthony straightened his tie in the mirror. "Either way, I'll hear her out." The next morning, Patricia waited in the hotel lobby, dressed in civilian clothes, her hair pulled back simply. She looked smaller somehow, without her uniform and perfect makeup. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice tight with nervousness. They sat in a quiet corner of the lobby cafe. Anthony ordered coffee for them both, then waited for her to speak. "I didn't sleep last night," Patricia finally said. "I kept thinking about how I treated you and your family. At first, I told myself it wasn't about race, that I would have questioned anyone who didn't look like they belonged in first class." She paused, staring into her coffee. "But that's the problem, isn't it? I had a picture in my head of who belongs there, and your family didn't match it." Anthony remained silent, letting her work through her thoughts. "My grandfather was a red-cap porter for 40 years, she continued. "He carried bags for rich white folks at Union Station, never complained, but he told me stories about how they looked through him like he was invisible." Her eyes filled with tears. "And yesterday, I did the exact same thing to you. I became what I always hated." Anthony leaned forward. "Recognition is the first step, Patricia." "I want to do more than recognize it," she said firmly. "I want to change it." She pulled a folder from her bag. "I stayed up all night writing this. It's a proposal for improving our first-class training. We focus so much on service details, the right fork, wine knowledge, proper terminology, but almost nothing on examining our biases." Anthony took the folder, impressed by her initiative. "You did this overnight?" Patricia nodded. "The assignment you gave me, teaching others, I want to take it seriously. But I need to start with myself first." Anthony flipped through her notes. The ideas were rough but showed genuine thought. "You know," he said slowly, "we've been wanting to revamp the customer service training program. This could be a good foundation." Hope flickered across Patricia's face. "You mean that?" "I do. But it won't be easy. Confronting biases never is." "I'm ready to do the work," she said, her voice steadier now. "Yesterday was the most humiliating moment of my career, but maybe it needed to happen." Anthony closed the folder. "Sometimes our worst moments lead to our greatest growth. I believe you can turn this around, Patricia." As he stood to leave, Patricia asked, "Why didn't you just fire me? Anyone else would have." Anthony smiled slightly. "Because firing you would have solved my problem, not the bigger one. And I've never been interested in quick fixes." 6 months later, Anthony stood at the back of a training room at Jackson Airways headquarters in Atlanta. 30 new flight attendants sat in rows, watching a presentation at the front. They hadn't noticed him slip in, which was exactly how he wanted it. Patricia stood at the podium, looking different than she had on that fateful flight. Her hair was simpler, her makeup lighter, but the biggest change was in her eyes. A new awareness that hadn't been there before. "Let me tell you about the worst day of my career," she began, her voice clear and steady. 6 months ago, I humiliated a family in first class because they didn't look like what I expected first-class passengers to look like." The room was silent as she recounted the story, leaving nothing out, not her dismissive tone, not her selective service, not her assumptions based on nothing but appearance. "What I didn't know," she continued, "was that the man I was disrespecting owned the entire airline." Murmurs rippled through the trainees. "But here's the thing," Patricia said, holding up her hand. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Every single passenger deserves the same respect, the same service, the same human dignity. That's what I failed to understand that day." At the back of the room, Anthony felt a presence beside him. It was Beverly, the lead flight attendant from the Los Angeles flight, now the director of in-flight services. "She's good," Beverly whispered. "Really good. The trainees connect with her story in a way they never did with our old diversity videos." Anthony nodded. Nothing teaches like the truth. Patricia clicked to a new slide. Unconscious bias isn't just a corporate buzzword. It's the split-second judgment you make about people based on appearance, accent, or name. We all have these biases. The key is recognizing them before they affect how we treat others. She divided the trainees into small groups for an exercise about recognizing bias in everyday situations. As they worked, she walked around the room, stopping to listen and guide conversations. "Mr. Wilson," Beverly said quietly, "the customer satisfaction scores for first class have gone up 12% since we implemented Patricia's training program. And complaints about discriminatory treatment? Down by almost 30% across all cabins." Beverly smiled. "Your instinct about her was right." Anthony watched as Patricia helped a young trainee work through a scenario. Sometimes people just need the chance to become better versions of themselves. After the training session ended, Patricia noticed Anthony and walked over. "How was it?" she asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "Powerful," he said honestly. "You've turned that experience into something valuable for everyone." Patricia's smile was genuine. "Your son's graduation was that weekend, wasn't it? I never got to congratulate you." "Thank you. Christopher's doing well. Actually, the airline's partnering with his sustainable fuel startup now." An awkward silence fell between them, the memory of their first meeting still present but fading. "You know," Patricia said finally, "my daughter asked me last week why I changed jobs within the company. She thought I'd been demoted." "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that I made a terrible mistake, but instead of firing me, my boss saw an opportunity for me to help fix a bigger problem." She looked directly at Anthony. "I told her sometimes our worst moments can become our most important ones if we're willing to learn from them." Anthony nodded, hearing his own words echoed back to him. "The training program goes nationwide next month. Every employee, not just flight crews." "I know. I'm nervous about it." "Don't be. Your story matters, Patricia. It's changing how people think." As they walked toward the elevators, Anthony asked, "Do you miss flying?" Patricia considered this. "Sometimes, but this work feels more important." The story had leaked online despite the company's efforts to keep it private. A passenger had posted about it, and it had gone viral within days. Rather than trying to suppress it, Anthony had made a bold decision, acknowledged it happened, and outlined the company's response, including the new training initiative. The elevator doors opened, and Denise stepped out, surprising them both. "Patricia," she said warmly. "The presentation was excellent." Patricia looked stunned. "You were there too." "Back row, other side." Denise smiled. "I wanted to see this famous training program for myself." As they rode down together, Patricia said, "Mrs. Wilson, I never properly apologized to you and your daughter. I'm truly sorry for how I treated your family." Denise's expression softened. "We've all been on journeys to overcome our biases, Patricia. The important thing is that you're helping others navigate theirs now." In the lobby, Anthony spotted his daughter Tanya waiting near the entrance. She was still skeptical about Patricia's transformation, still angry about what had happened. "There's Tanya," he said. "She's joining us for lunch." Patricia tensed visibly. "I should probably go." "Actually," Denise said gently, "we were hoping you'd join us. Tanya included." Patricia looked uncertain. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Anthony watched his daughter, thinking about how different she was from him, more direct, less willing to let things go. But she was learning too, in her own way. "Reconciliation doesn't happen without discomfort," he said. "We have to be willing to sit with it." As they walked toward Tanya, Anthony thought about that day 6 months ago. One flight, one incident, one choice to respond with education rather than anger. Sometimes the smallest moments created the biggest ripples. "Ready?" Denise asked, squeezing his hand. Anthony nodded. In his company and in his life, this was the work that mattered most, bringing people together across the divisions that kept them apart. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was always worth it.